Get on up.
Everybody right there.
Get into it.
Everybody right there.
Get involved.
Everybody just come on up.
Hello and welcome to The Public Good. This is Andrea O'Sullivan from the Partnership for the Public Good, or PPG, which unites 271 community organizations working to build a better Buffalo. We're delighted to be joining you from now on every Tuesday at 7 p.m. This week we'll be speaking with India Walton, lead community organizer on justice and opportunity for Open Buffalo. India will talk with us on inequities in marijuana enforcement in Buffalo and on possible solutions. The continuing disparities in marijuana arrests, which we'll dive into shortly, raise issues around public safety and community policing, racial justice, and lost economic benefits for our communities. And later in the show, we'll also hear from Chris Alexander, the policy coordinator in the New York office of Drug Policy Alliance, on these issues and a statewide campaign for legalization. Don't forget to follow PPG on Facebook and Twitter, and of course you can always get great information on our website, ppgbuffalo.org. The Public Good is sponsored in part by Univera Healthcare, real people who really care. Video of this show is on our Facebook page at facebook.com/ppgbuffalo, and you can also find videos from previous week's shows on our YouTube page. Before we begin our conversation on marijuana enforcement and possible legalization, I want to call your attention to a few important events coming up. First, this Thursday, November 9th, is the Buffalo Research Collective meeting on campaign finance. And this is a research-a-thon. A group of community folks will come together, bring a laptop if you have one, and the Public Accountability Initiative will walk you through researching contributions from the most powerful people and companies in Buffalo to politicians and political campaigns. That will be this Thursday, November 9th from 7 to 9 p.m. at the Grant Street Neighborhood Center at 271 Grant Street. Bring a laptop, but pizza, pop, and power research are provided. And today we're joining you on Election Day. It's 7 p.m. when you're hearing this, but Liberty Cab has taken a great step of providing free rides to polls for voters this Election Day. You can call Liberty Cab at 716-877-711, press 0, and then use the code LibertyRide2Vote. That's Liberty Ride, the number 2, vote. And they will take you to your polling place free of charge. It's also the time of year where Partnership for the Public Good is seeking proposals from our 271 partners for policy priorities for the year ahead. So if you're listening and you're part of a PPG member organization, you can send me an email, andrea@ppgbuffalo.org, or visit our homepage where we describe the process of sending us one of your policy priorities for next year. And in December, our partners will come together, and the top 10 voted issues that they select will drive our research work. It will inform what you hear on this very radio show throughout next year. And finally, before we begin, I'm going to call your attention to an event that is on the very topic we're discussing today. Next Monday, November 13th, from 6 to 8 p.m. will be Marijuana Enforcement in Buffalo and Legalization Solutions, and that's organized by Open Buffalo, PPG, and the Drug Policy Alliance. That's happening again from 6 to 8 at 2421 Main Street. And we'll discuss more about this, but the discussion is going to look at the long-term costs and consequences of unequal enforcement of marijuana prohibition in Buffalo. And we're going to discuss together how do we address the harms caused to communities and efforts to legalize marijuana in New York State while creating a diverse and inclusive economic industry. So at that event next week, we're going to launch a new report by the partners PPG, Open Buffalo, and Drug Policy Alliance. And we have gathered official data from New York State on marijuana arrests over the last 5 years in Buffalo and Erie County. And what we found is that across New York State in 2016, 80% of those arrested for low-level marijuana possession in 2016 were Black or Hispanic people. And the disparity here in Buffalo is actually slightly worse than that statewide number. From 2012 to 2016, over 2,000 people were arrested in Buffalo for low-level marijuana possession. 86% of those were people of color, even though Buffalo's population is 51% people of color. And actually, across Erie County, 76% of those arrested for low-level marijuana possession were people of color, even though Erie County's population is only 18% people of color. So India Walton, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
How can we explain that disparity? Is there a difference in how people of different racial backgrounds use marijuana?
Well, we know, and we've known for quite some time, that rates of usage among white people and black people are relatively the same, and in certain age groups it's actually higher among white people. And I think what we see is just a result of chronic over-policing and policies that really have affected black and brown people disproportionately.
And yes, do you also know, what do we know about kind of support for legalization? So we have these numbers that tell us as many as 58% of young white folks have tried marijuana. That number for African Americans is more like 50%. So if we have more than half of our population experimenting with marijuana, what do we know about, do people generally support legalization?
I get a sense from the community that in general people support legalization. I think that what I would like to stress in this campaign is that we're not promoting the use of marijuana. What we're really doing is addressing the social impacts that marijuana prohibition has had on our communities for such a long time.
And we know actually that since Colorado and Washington became the first states to legally regulate marijuana in 2012, support for legalization has increased up to around 60% nationally. Mm-hmm. So, you'd have a sense from talking to folks in Buffalo whether that seems accurate here. But there are now more arrests for marijuana possession annually across the U.S. than for all violent crimes. So again, we see this kind of impact of really focusing in on low-level, simple marijuana possession as something to arrest people for, even more so than for violent crimes. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at these numbers, as we said, we see 86% of arrests are people of color, 14% whites. How do you, as an organizer from a diverse community, as a mother, how do you respond to those disparities?
I really feel like marijuana possession, simple possession, is sort of a gateway to police contact. I think a lot of times it's used as a tool for profiling, and I think it's astonishing that even though black people use marijuana at relatively the same or even less than white people, that we're arrested and incarcerated more frequently. Penalties tend to be steeper, and even though we decriminalized marijuana in the 1970s, we're still seeing the effects of marijuana prohibition every day.
Yes, so tell us about that, about decriminalizing marijuana in the 1970s, because I think a lot of community members are not really aware that that step was taken.
I don't think that community members are aware that the step was taken because it hasn't affected the way policing is done in our community when it comes to marijuana and possession of marijuana. And I think that the perception is that in communities of color, marijuana is a bigger issue than in white communities, but I think that it's just the presence of police and the reason why people are stopped is more the problem.
So as you're saying, since the 1980s in the United States, we've seen a massive increase in the overall number of arrests and convictions for drug offenses, and that's often referred to, right, as the war on drugs. Many people now would call it the failed war on drugs. And around the same time, we also started to see what's called the broken windows theory or style of policing emerge. So what's that for listeners who might not know, broken windows policing?
So broken windows policing is a very aggressive policy of policing where in highly impacted communities, and when I say highly impacted, I mean they're primarily occupied by people of color and poor people, where it's just aggressive tactics that are used to prevent crime. But what it actually does is it really impacts people more in a financial way. People are being stopped and frisked. It really places like entire communities under this guise of suspicion and over policing to prevent crime, and it studies show that it doesn't work.
And this has been documented over and over. Michelle Alexander's book is quite known now, The New Jim Crow, kind of really showing that this spike in drug arrests had these huge knock-on effects for communities, as you said. And we know that as these policies took hold in the 1990s, marijuana arrests accounted for nearly 80% of the rise in drug arrests nationwide. And in 2015, 43% of all drug arrests in the United States were for marijuana. That is actually, my friends, over 640,000 arrests across our country, and almost 90% of those arrests were for possession alone, not for sale, not for manufacture of marijuana. And again, we see right here in Buffalo that same narrative playing out, where we still have several hundred arrests a year that are for the lowest level of marijuana possession. These are not folks that are manufacturing, selling, getting involved in that way. And one thing we're looking at is the long-term effects that even just one marijuana arrest can have for an individual or a family. Do you want to share what that might look like for people?
Yeah, I mean, besides the fact that you now have an arrest record that may become a criminal record, it can disqualify you from job opportunities, in some cases housing. But we also know that for a lot of our young people, just having police contact can also escalate into other situations, including abuse, excessive use of force, and in some unfortunate cases, even death. So we really want to be able to prevent people from having to come in contact with police unnecessarily.
And we see, I think, in many communities around the country, these policies we mentioned of broken windows, over-policing, the war on low-level drug possession is really starting to be questioned. And some police forces are moving toward more community policing, as we call it. And your work with Open Buffalo's Justice and Opportunity Coalition really focuses on how can the Buffalo police take on some more of these policies. And they have taken on some initiatives. But to me, it seems that this is a particular area where, as you've said, it brings more police into contact with folks. The vast majority, actually, of these arrests we've mentioned in Buffalo are young black men. And then we do see, as you said, that just a marijuana charge, not even a conviction, brings the expenses of fines and fees, of missing work for repeated appearances in court. You mentioned you might not be able to get access to a housing loan. It's the same with employment, with education and student loans. So this is happening to you when you're 18, 19, 20 years old. You could be facing consequences for quite a long time. And so tell us, India, what are advocates doing in Buffalo to look toward solutions?
So this is super exciting. We're working along with Drug Policy Alliance and Partnership for the Public Good. And Assemblywoman Crystal Peoples-Stokes has sponsored a bill in the Assembly. It's called the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, and we very affectionately refer to it as MRTA. So next week we're having a series of events to launch the Buffalo campaign in support of legalization of marijuana in a way that is responsible and really addresses the social disparities that marijuana prohibition has caused. So Monday there will be a community event at the offices of 1199 SEIU. That's at 2421 Main Street in Buffalo. At 6 p.m., we're inviting the public and the community to come out and really have a conversation about the impacts that marijuana reform can have on our community.
And with that, I'd love to bring in Chris Alexander from Drug Policy Alliance. Are you there, Chris?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you so much for calling in to join us, and we're looking forward to having you in Buffalo in person next week.
I'm excited to be there.
So I'd love to just have you add your voice and experience on what India has told us so far about MRTA, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. A lot of your research has focused on the impacts that we've been speaking about, but in the greater New York City area. But I know you're reaching out to Buffalo to reach out for the statewide impacts of this. So what should folks here in Buffalo and Erie County know?
Sure thing. So the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, as India noted, is a really important piece of legislation looking to end prohibition, marijuana prohibition altogether in New York. Now, there are a lot of collateral consequences that India mentioned as it relates to marijuana prohibition enforcement. But really what this legislation does is not only take care of those issues or address those issues, but it moves forward into creating a regulatory structure for the taxing and the sale and the production of marijuana, similar to the way that alcohol is regulated. At this point, 8 states have moved in this direction. And so New York, the New York legislation is really a bit of a lessons learned from those states and the struggles that they've had and successes that they've had from regulating marijuana. The key thing that we like to highlight and make sure is discussed is that in these states that have moved forward, the sky hasn't fallen, right? There have been a lot of positive outcomes and almost no negative ones, right? And so we're excited to have this model piece of legislation here in New York and to have a legislator like Assemblymember Crystal Peoples-Stokes be the sponsor of that legislation.
That's great. And we focused a lot on this show so far on the criminal justice and policing impacts of marijuana prohibition. I think overall, you've argued that rather than adding to public safety, prohibition can actually undermine it by criminalizing individuals, but also by driving what can be a quite violent underground economy. So what do you at Drug Policy Alliance see as the benefits of the potential industry that this could bring?
Yeah, I mean, on the forefront, we do this work because we're committed to ending the war on drugs. And so the criminalization of people of color in this state and in this country is our primary issue. However, we do see that the creation of these types of regulatory markets are overall beneficial to a lot of additional kind of parallel goals that we have in regulating marijuana. For example, one is reducing young people's access to the substance. Again, we are the drug policy reformers, but we're not advocating for use of any drugs and not advocating for young people in particular to be using marijuana. However, in the current system, there is no barrier to young people access, and by creating a system of regulation, maybe there's a better opportunity to do so. Some of the other things that are really important to us is the concept of community reinvestment. Now, states like Colorado and California are making quite a bit of money off of marijuana regulation. California's recreational adult use market hasn't opened yet, but they have had medical for some time. But they've been able to use those types of resources, particularly in Colorado, to rebuild schools at a time when cities like Buffalo and New York are closing them. This is a very keen interest of a lot of people across the state, this potential revenue and what it can do to revitalize communities across the state. So we're also excited about that. And so we see those as kind of two big benefits of moving forward in this direction.
And one interesting piece that I saw in your research as well was, we focused a lot on communities of color here, and I think neighborhoods of Black and African American folks that have a long history of being over-policed. You also mentioned immigrant communities and the fact that arrests for marijuana possession can lead to deportation, and in fact do so on quite a large scale. I read that simple marijuana possession was the fourth most common cause of deportation related to an offense in 2013. So have you seen this as an issue that brings together communities of new Americans with long-term communities of color?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is, the immigration issue, the immigration consequences, particularly in this moment that we're in, where there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment being spewed by people in public positions. This is one of the biggest tools that's been used to really force people out, and into the criminal justice system and into deportation proceedings. And so we see marijuana reform as an opportunity to remove one of the biggest tools. Again, there are larger issues in the immigration context that need to be addressed, and we hope people will figure those systems out. But one thing that is important is that there's no reason why families should be torn apart because of marijuana use, and so we're interested really in protecting families and keeping those families together. There's also kind of the separation of families in terms of child welfare, where we see children taken away from mothers and other parents because of marijuana use, and used often as justification to continue these types of proceedings. And so we see the way that marijuana prohibition has played a role in really disrupting communities. And so we think this is a great step forward to end that disruption.
And you've already mentioned that under MRTA, under the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, there would be, of course, a system similar to alcohol where access to marijuana for underage folks, people under 21, would be very regulated. I think that's one issue that we hear coming up in the community, is that for those folks who are not fully yet behind legalization, there are questions of how does this actually play out? Will it just be this kind of free-for-all? So I think it would be interesting to hear, this doesn't make everything having to do with marijuana legal. It makes, use, production, sale of certain amounts. So it'd be interesting for you to tell us, are there still any criminal penalties related to marijuana that would be in effect?
Yeah, and definitely there are still criminal penalties that will remain in effect. But I also wanted to just provide the context that the best way for people to kind of understand how this would work is by simply looking at how the alcohol industry operates currently, right? You've got people who produce the alcohol, who grow the barley and grow the wheat, and do those other activities related to the agricultural production, but then people who process it and people who are in your local liquor stores and grocery stores that sell it. It'll be a very similar regulatory market, because that's what we've seen has also been effective in other states. And now in terms of stuff that remains penalized, there's a market being created, and so just like how bootlegging of alcohol is currently not allowed, it's the same thing that would be prohibited under a regulated marijuana market, where people, if you're interested, we want to make sure there's avenues for you to operate within the market and not outside of it. And so there's a strong incentive to make sure there is a small business focus, so that people who are interested in participating in the industry have an avenue to move forward. But also, selling to minors is something that will get somebody's license taken away, and would result in criminal penalties, the same way that selling alcohol to minors is currently enforced. And so, really taking positive steps to make sure that if there's an interest in protecting the children, as often we hear, then we actually do so in a thoughtful way, but also want to make sure that people have an opportunity to access the market. So those are some of the things that will still be criminalized.
And Chris, my last question for you is another that we're hearing from some of our community members, is just that we've said, there have been 2,000 arrests just in the last 5 years in Buffalo and Erie County on marijuana. So what happens to those folks if MRTA is passed? What happens to previously arrested and convicted people on low-level marijuana possession?
Frankly, that's the part of the legislation that I'm most excited about. It's an opportunity for New York State to really clear pathway forward, right, for opportunities for almost 1 million New Yorkers who have previous marijuana-related convictions on their record. Since the time of the launching of Prohibition, we have probably about 1 million folks who have low-level arrests on their record. Many of those arrests and convictions would be either vacated or sealed under the pending legislation, the MRTA. And so this is a great opportunity to give people, new pathways forward. This is a law that was inherently racially motivated and has been racially enforced. And so if we decide to move forward and end the practice, it's important that we also go backwards and take care of the damage that has been done to certain communities and to certain populations.
Great, thank you so much. India, I'd also love to hear, is there any other impact of this legislation you want to raise before we close out?
I'm really excited about the prospect of an above ground economy. So most people know that I tend to lean very far to the left. So I just want to ensure that our people have access to the above ground economy, because there is revenue to be generated, and I really see this as a way to begin to lift people out of poverty as well. So.
And then for our community members and listeners who are concerned about over-policing, about the issue of reducing arrests, which is a main goal of Open Buffalo's Justice and Opportunity Coalition, I just want to point out, in 2016, arrests for low-level marijuana possession made up 10% of all misdemeanor, all low-level drug arrests in Erie County. So with this one piece of legislation, we could actually cut out 10% of low-level drug arrests in Erie County. For those who are concerned about addiction, I know in many of our reports and meetings we've argued for services rather than punishment for those who may cross the line into addiction on many different drugs. So I think it's just interesting from a racial justice perspective to really see this could have a broad, pretty quick impact. So with that, I will just invite India to remind us one more time about the event that's happening next Monday. And thank you to both Chris Alexander of Drug Policy Alliance and India Walton of Open Buffalo for joining us.
Yes, please join us Monday, November 13th at the offices of 1199 SEIU at 6 p.m. That is at 2421 Main Street. There is an Eventbrite up, and there's also an event on Facebook. It's free and open to the public. Please come out. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about it so we can fix it.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm Andrea O'Sullivan with Partnership for the Public Good, or PPG, which unites 270 organizations working to build a better Buffalo. Join us next week, Tuesday, November 14th at 7 p.m. here on the Public Good on Power 96 FM and Mix 1080 AM.
Everybody over there!
Get on up.
Everybody right there!
Get into it.